This evening, the title of tonight's webinar is Religion and Racism, Cultivating Anti-Racist Communities of Faith. And we have a very distinguished group of people with us tonight, some fantastic speakers. We have Sir Geoff Palmer and Pastor Dare Adetuberu, if I get that correct. Obviously, not too bad. And members, obviously, of Edinburgh Interfaith and Dublin City Interfaith Forum. We're exploring how we can cultivate anti-racist communities of faith. Some great pleasure to introduce our first speaker of the evening. I think well known to many people, both sides of the water, I think now. Sir Geoff is a human rights activist who works to tackle discrimination and promote equality in the UK. He was Scotland's first ever black professor and is known to have discovered the barley abrasion process whilst a researcher at the Brewing Research Foundation, which will have another interest to those of our friends in Dublin who are fond of Guinness. There are other stories that we will come into here. So Geoff is well known for his amazing work in human rights, helping to tackle discrimination, promote equality in the UK. And obviously a lot of people have seen some of the fantastic work around raising awareness of the slave trade, anti-racist education, just some incredible work that's going on.
Much, Ian. Yes, I remember Dublin well and going over to Guinness. In fact, I was their consultant for quite a while and did trips to Africa for them. Am I on mute? Oh, I'm okay.
We can hear you.
Yeah, you can hear me. Yes, as I said, I was the Guinness consultant, and they eventually asked me to go to Africa for them because they have large business interest in Nigeria. And I helped them to use the local grain, which has been of large benefit to people in Africa since, instead of having to import. Well, anyway, that's the scientific side and my academic side, but my people are very surprised when I wrote that article for you to realize that I have some links with the church, and they were rather extensive because they go back to when I was a boy in Jamaica. And my mother left Jamaica in 1951 to migrate to London. So she was a very old member of the Windrush generation. That's 1951. And during her absence between 1951 and 1955, my aunts looked after me. And what I've said to many people, that during that period from 51 to 55, all I can remember in detail about that period was my aunt ensuring that I went to church 3 times every Sunday. I went to morning service, Sunday school, and then night service. And of course, there were Sunday school picnics, which was like once a year. But therefore, my education and the education I received mainly was from a school next door to the church. So we had what we call church schools, and it was North Street Congregational Church and the school and the church. It was built, and organized initially by a missionary, from London. So it is approaching 200 years old. And therefore, my religion and what I've learned about Christianity is, as I said in my article, it's about, in fact, developing a lifestyle, which, it's about developing certain values and values in terms of moral values. So I recently wrote an article about the royal visit, and I spoke about, actions speak louder than words. And that's one of the things that I learned at church and Sunday school, I said in the article. And therefore, to me, religion is not just only about words. And one of the things I remember about Jesus, he went in and overturned tables of moneylenders. He didn't just talk about it. And therefore, I believe that where there is injustice, then talking about it is not enough. It's about figuring out ways to effect change. Now, I learned that at my church and school in Jamaica, and I left Jamaica in 1955, and I came to London to join my mother. Now, one of the historical aspects of that period, you know, when I came in 1955, I went to church with my mother, and the church was in Islington. And, you know, we were the only two Black people in that church. And eventually the minister told, you know, my mother and I, that, you know, he felt we were driving away his usual people who attended the church. And we stopped going. Now, this was not uncommon. And this was the beginning of a lot of the Black churches in England, which are now extremely significant and independent. But in many ways, I know, because I do a lot of work with people in say, Birmingham. I'm a member of the Jamaica Association in Birmingham, and I'm a patron of a Black organization in London. And, you know, they work with the church in terms of the education work they do for children. Now, as far as I'm concerned, you know, I still have those values, and part of the way I approach the history, and how, which I will mention a little about, and how I approach the race relation work that I do. I'm a member of an organization called LREC, and that's, you know, was a race equality organization, and we just changed it now into an inequality organization. I'm probably the longest serving member of that. I'm on the committee of various other organizations that has interest in race. I work with the police in terms of, I'm on some committees. And since the death of George Floyd, then a lot of these organizations have become more, you know, involved in matters to do with race. And it's rather interesting, but very sad, that a lot of this increased interest in the rights of people have come about because of a man who was killed over 9 minutes with the law with its hands in his pocket. Over 9 minutes with the law with its hand in his pocket, actually believing that nothing would happen because this has happened before. However, as my mom used to say, God works in a mysterious way, his wonders to perform. And therefore, we have got a completely different world. And we have no excuses in terms of addressing, you know, the racism in our society. You know, from 1748, we have David Hume, who actually got up one morning and said, Negroes are inferior to whites, in his view. And the point is that he had an attack on miracles by saying they are unnatural because they're against the laws of nature. That's the concept. That's Hume, the great mind, philosopher. against the laws of nature, and they require that you've got to prove divine intervention. But my view simply is that, you know, the fact that he says Negroes are inferior to whites, then in fact he believes in miracles on the basis of what he said. And therefore, as far as I'm concerned, the church and the people in academia have got to start addressing old views like that. And many people are frightened to do that because it's against the establishment. The point is that if you do a survey of people in the world, and no matter what they say about Black people, the fact is that that concept of humour is in the back of their heads. That's the power of views that come out of academia. The fact is that that view was used to enslave people, to justify it. That view was also used by Chauvin with his hands in his pocket and Floyd. He believed that. And therefore, to me, the church I belong to is a church that challenges. That, in fact, and this is what I've tried to do, in a sense that when I looked at the Henry Dundas plaque in Edinburgh, and I used to walk around it and I read it, and the historical fact is that he, you know, he initiated, because a lot of historians are saying he didn't do it on his own, you know, on the House of Lords, what I call excuses. The point is that he initiated it. And that's why I use that term, so there can be no, you know, excuses. And that act was not on his plaque. And the council, we spent 2 years debating it. No result. And after George Floyd's death, the leader of the council rang me. I gave a Black Lives Matter talk. And the leader of the council rang me and said, Geoff, you know, we were talking about Black Lives Matter and let's reform the committee. And within 2 weeks, we had a narrative which actually had the word slavery in it on that plaque for the first time in 200 years. Now, the point is that, how did it take that long? And therefore, one of the things that I feel that the interfaith and the church must do is to be aware of the debates that are going on in society at the present time, whether it relates to the East India Company. I had a minister of the church speaking to me yesterday about it. He was writing an article and consulted me. Also, I've had to deal with various other people from all over the world, whether it's Toronto, Africa, the Caribbean, all wanting to know how can we address this issue of race. And at an academic meeting I had recently, one of the views was, but it's the past, Geoff, you know, let it go. It's, and I had to use my old statement, you know, we cannot change the past, but we can change consequences such as racism for the better using education. And therefore, you know, finally, I don't want to take up too much time. The point is that if we're going to tackle racism, you know, in our society, and if we're going to have anti-racism, part of the anti-racist community, then we must see where the lie is and speak the truth. Because I don't believe you can have a faith, irrespective of its beliefs, where the truth isn't the primary aim. And thus, as far as I'm concerned, truth works. And it's our responsibility to ensure that we challenge the lie and speak the truth. And we've got to do it on issues that are current, as well as those in the past which affect the way we live today. Thank you.
Delighted to continue our collaboration and working together with our friends at Edinburgh Interfaith Association. Earlier, we were talking about introductions, and since I was asked to introduce our own speaker, our DCIF speaker, Pastor Dare Adetuberu, I was looking at his introduction on our website, and it says that he is a senior pastor of the Redeemed Christian Church of God, an eminent scholar and theologian, and former principal of the Bible College of the Redeemed Bible College in Ireland. But having looked at that, I was thinking, that is not right. He is so much more than that, and involved in so many other activities, and so we're gonna have to remedy that. Pastor Dare Adetuberu is also sitting together with myself on the Garda National Diversity Forum, which is a group that works with our police force here in Ireland and advises the police force and the police officers at the higher rank with the implementation of their new diversity and integration strategy.
Again, everyone, thank you, Adrian, and thank you for giving me the wonderful task of coming to speak after Sir Geoff's wonderful speech. Thank you very much. I just want to really applaud what has been said by Sir Geoff, and I think the bone for the context of this seminar tonight has been very well articulated and presented by him in terms of cultivating the anti-racist communities. And like Adrian had said earlier, we in Ireland are relatively new because the migrant experience is a relatively new phenomenon here. But having said that, I think we have a few inroads that has been made, and we hope that we will learn more. So I'll say a few things about that. First of all, about myself. I'm originally from Nigeria, Lagos in Nigeria, and I was born post-colonialism, so grew up in a homogeneous Black African environment, so quite oblivious in my personal experience of what racism or slavery per se were about. They were experiences that I learned about or got involved as I became an adult. It was actually quite foreign and surprising to me. So the definitions, for example, of like Sir Geoff has been saying, being different or being inferior caught me by surprise. I didn't even understand what it meant. because growing up, my father had some business partners that were in the United Kingdom that will come over to our home back in Nigeria, and we'll have dinner, they exchange things and all that. So I just understood that we were different, but I didn't understand, the hierarchy. So that's on a personal level. And now growing up, and becoming a person of faith and being involved in the church and coming here, I maybe rather naively, had just gotten involved with things. But as I engaged a bit, I experienced some of what Sir Geoff had said earlier. But I now decide on my own that, there is, just like he said, a need to reach out to interventions, education, involvement, to sort of engage with the evolving race dialogue in Ireland, and hopefully to bring a positive light, through, I believe, interactions just like the ones we're having now is also a form of awareness and education of different backgrounds. And so, like Adrian had said, been involved in quite a number of organizations there. And I think it's been largely positive in Ireland. That's I will say, in all my years, I think I've had 2 or 3 experiences or interactions that I could really point out that stood out for me. But those were also overcome by friendship and education. So I believe, as a person of faith, that the church in particular is mandated to operate, because it's inception, from what we know from the scriptures, in a non-discriminatory formation. For those who might be familiar with it, I'm referring to the book of Acts, where people could hear people speaking in their languages, about 15 different languages of different people groups. So there's a clear demonstration that is the formation, the birth, the formation, and the life of the church. So I believe in the faith environment, we are mandated, if we are to go by the requirement of scriptures, to create environments where people's languages, although they are different, could be understood, and we have interactions in that with that model. And that, for me, creates a environment, communities that are peaceful, that are prosperous, that is all encompassing for everyone. So like I said, not saying too much beyond Sir Geoff, but that's where we are, and that's what's driving what we're trying to do. Thank you very much.
So first question, just before we go then, is, do you believe the recent incident between the 2 black men at the Oscars, well, we're talking about Will Smith, and the ensuing media storm, is an opportunity to broaden the discussion regarding racism? If so, how should this discussion begin, and how should the faith community play a role? And what's the fin? And the last point is the longer one. 3 thoughts from academia, 2 from my faith communities in 2006, well, in equality and diversity training at the University of Glasgow, asking how people felt about segregation of community and culture and faith in Scotland. I was told in certain terms that racism was not a problem here. There was only one black person, a researcher in the room. I suspect he was not entirely comfortable with speaking. Is there a question? I've heard this many times. How do we deal with the shutdown? Yeah, that is a point. So there's 2 questions here. I'm sure, Sir Geoff, and maybe Dare, you've heard these questions, and maybe Mandy might want to come in. Racism is not a problem here. It's not something that we have in Scotland. And you have this, I don't know if they have the equivalent in Ireland. Some people use this expression, we're all Jack Tamson's bairns, as if to say Scotland is this heaven heavenly place of equality, which doesn't reflect the reality. Geoff, do you want to say something on that question and maybe then back to the gospel then?
Well, yes, I think the point is when somebody says that, they should say to themselves, what is the distribution of non-white people in Scotland, a percentage of the population? And then I say to you, look around your office, look around your management of our society, look around our parliament, our councils, and then you will see that we're a diverse society without diverse management. And as I've said before, you know, a diverse society requires diverse management to be fair and efficient. And I did some work with the NHS in Edinburgh, where they only had 4 managers from the ethnic community, 4 from the big nursing community. And when we set up a course, within, 3 years, we had over 20. So here we had a lack of representation, which is not noticed or known. And so therefore we have this inequality here. It's just that we've given it no attention. And thus people believe and that it doesn't exist. And this is why I say with the faith community, if this is the truth, then you've got to say so. People will listen to you. We're that kind of community. In fact, when I was at school, the 2 people with the most power in the society is the minister of the church and the teacher. That's whom we went to. And therefore, we've lost that. And I therefore feel that we've got to get back to where we will speak the truth. We will see it and know that's the case. And therefore, that person who said that is probably quite right, because he's never heard it anywhere that that's not the case.
Yeah, I think it depends whose perspective that's coming from. And we hear this a lot, it's not a problem, but actually, who is it that's actually saying that it's not a problem? I hear it loads. Oh, it's not a problem. We don't have a problem with racism. And sometimes it's a bit of, like head in the sand. If we say there's not a problem, then there's not a problem because we don't want to talk about it. And actually there is, but we also don't want to face up to it either. And we don't want to face it, and we don't really have to, because if we say there's not a problem, then we don't need to do anything. Do you know what I mean? It doesn't exist. We don't need to do anything. We don't have to talk about it. And actually what that does is shuts down the conversation and denies the people the opportunity to voice their concerns. And sometimes it's not a problem because there is nowhere to voice the problem. There's nowhere to go. So because people don't know who to approach, don't know who to speak to about it, don't want to rock the boat, don't want to be seen as that person that's causing a problem, right? They just want to keep their head down and get through. It's difficult enough without drawing attention to themselves, because they stick out enough, especially if I was brought up in Ayrshire in a seaside town with probably one of the very few Black people in the whole town. So you stuck out and you just want to blend into the crowd where possible, keep your head down. And so when people say there's not a problem, inevitably there is, but they either don't want to face it, don't want to listen to it, or don't hear it because they don't allow people, they're not approachable, they don't allow people to speak about what the issues are. And so, yeah, I still hear that a lot. That's why I'm involved in what I'm involved in the church. There's not a problem in the church. Well, either is what I would tell you.
Thank you. Dare, do you want to come in?
Yeah, quite right. Just once again, like Sir Geoff said earlier, it's to look at the percentage population representation in any organization to know if the problem exists or not. There is a church where I attend an annual summer conference in Chicago in the US, and the lead pastor said something. He said, we discovered after a while, he said we were all white and we were all right, but we we discovered that we were living in a city that's so diverse, but they had 7,000 people and everybody was right. And they thought it was fine. Somebody just woke up one day and said, this is not all right, you know? And they went about trying to change their model to something that will reflect the community they lived in. And over the course of 5 years, they were intentional about it, and they now had a richer, more diverse church population. It took a while to adjust to the culture, but it really became more healthy and rewarding for them. So the problem does exist, and I would say in the Irish context, particularly in working with the police here, they are admitting that. In fact, I remember in the last 2 months or so, one of the police superintendents was saying to me now that, look, we were saying there's not much of a problem, just like we're saying here, that but we discovered that we're all 5 white male police superintendents saying there's no racism problem. That, okay, you tell me, is there a problem? I said, yes, sir, there is a problem. You know, so then how do we go about doing, making this? So having these conversations and learning from this, I believe it helps us to keep moving in the right direction.
And can I ask you just that last question about the Will Smith incident? Has this, what has this done? Is this more opportunities to discuss the equality issue, or what has this done, or is this damaged in some ways? Well, I don't know how we're supposed to react to that question. Geoff, I think you're going to say.
I don't think it's, I think it's just, to me, as what somebody said on my Twitter, you know, that Will Smith lost a great opportunity to actually, during his speech, to rebut it.
Yeah.
And the point is that it's a lesson, not just for white people, but also black people. You know, that in difficult circumstances, my mother used to say, you got to know when to bite your lip. and therefore is that he will regret it. Yeah. In a sense, he lost a great opportunity to have rebutted a very unacceptable statement and have turned it into a stereotype, because that's what white people will see it as. You know, and we've got to speak out what it is and what people are thinking. Because if we don't do that, whether you're black or white or blue, you've got to say things that you think that could be the correct approach, or if you think whatever. And what I'm saying, it's this, what we are concerned about here, we've just said, it's about the stereotype. You know, black people fight, whatever. They're not smart enough to address the issue in a very sophisticated manner. And what I'm saying is that he should have done that, and he won't do that again.
Thank you, Ian, and thank you for arranging this, as usual, very excellent program with 2 really dynamic and insightful speakers. Our group explored a little bit further the issue with the Academy Awards. And one of the comments that was made, which I thought was excellent, is that words need to be chosen carefully. Whether you're a comedian or a writer, a songwriter, words matter. And so the use of words is critical going forward. And oftentimes we can use racist words without even being aware. And I recommended a book to the group called How to Be an Anti-Racist by Kenzie, which has been of great help to me as kind of a guide to improve my language in terms of various races. And the other thing we talked about was how, of the 2 men, Chris Rock literally followed the biblical verse of turn the other cheek, because he did not respond in anger. He did not go in the press. He didn't press charges against the perpetrator. And finally, one of our members said how important it is, since we all tend to live in silos or ghettos, to have forums like this through IFA to bring us all together, but to bring people together of wider differences, color, gender, etc., to lower some of those barriers between us.
I think in our group, it's been talked a lot about steps and perception, and how do we challenge them in a way that everyone is comfortable with. That's one of the key features in the conversation in our group. I think we talked about, or people talked about, the importance of creating the space for people to come together and share their stories, but challenging churches, faith communities in being proactive, if I'm right in summing up here. Basically, there's a great deal of work for faith communities, for churches, to do in tackling racism, responding to racism, looking at education, early education, at all levels, including their own members.
Was the conversation closers, and I think it was around this question about, also, we don't have racism here. We don't, and we spoke a bit about how, what does that, where's that come from? What does that actually mean? And sometimes it's that perception about, well, we don't have racism here because, we don't want to deal with it. We don't want to talk about it. If we don't talk about it, it's not happening. It may just simply be that, who's saying that? Is that, coming from a perspective that doesn't look, wider than it itself? And so we spoke a bit about that, the conversation closers about, well, we don't have racism. It's not something that happens here, that happens in America, not here. We talked also about how sometimes when we do bring up racism, people go quite on the defensive, and it's like, oh, whoa, what about me? We the clearances here in Scotland, so, what about what happens in Ireland? What about, and it's like, how come? And again, it's that moving the conversation away, because we don't want to talk about it. We don't want to think that we're part of the problem, because that's got to be somebody else's problem, because it's never happened to us. We would never do that, and it's that reality of being willing to talk about it, being willing to own up to it, and not allow conversations to be closed down. One of the things I was saying was, we very much use that, we're all one in Christ. We love that term, don't we? We're all one in Christ, right? And sometimes that's used as a conversation closer, because when people talk about difference and diversity, we're like, but we're all one in Christ, so that's it. End of discussion. We're not talking about it. But what happens when you do that is you close that conversation, that person still has no voice. They're still not included. And so if we're really truly all one in Christ, we totally have to be inclusive, and we have to allow people to be who they are, and to be those diverse people, and to be diverse, and to come together and to recognise that. And so sometimes without meaning it, and sometimes absolutely with meaning it, in faith communities, we can close the conversation down because we don't want to talk about it.
Yeah, we had that conversation around restorative justice and the need to use restorative justice more rather than just going straight to hate crime legislation. I think that's quite an important one. But I was just reflecting, Mandy, on some of the things that you've been saying just now here in terms of this doesn't happen here and that shutting down thing. There are different levels of racism as well. I was wondering, and we're wondering about how the churches in terms tackle these things. I have a number of friends from African communities who've moved to Scotland, and I don't know if Dare, and if this echoes it in Ireland. And a lot of the questions people get are, so have you just moved here? And it might just be people who have lived here, that, you know, they've been here for maybe 20 years or more. And I think some people said, yeah, we just moved here. We just moved from Glasgow to Edinburgh. And no, that's not what I meant. I meant, you know, there's always a hidden question here. So there are these different levels of, and how do we even call it these kind of things at that simple level? And I'm thinking from my own background, I was a school teacher in the Borders and Peebles for a number of years. And there was always being said to me, we don't have racism in Peebles. We don't have racism in the school. In racism, in Peebles, the only area actually where my wife suffered the N-word and been called names. And part of the problem is there was very little diversity within the school. And this idea that racism only exists in inner cities is something that needs to be called out as well. We often have racism where people have no examples or role models or people that young people can have conversations with and have that diversity and be exposed to diversity. So it happens on very different levels.
I suppose it's really sort of important to sort of remember that, you know, faith communities in themselves have huge bodies of compassion. But the big issue is that very often, as someone mentioned the word silos, that the issue very often is that the church itself or the congregation or the faith expression may be reinventing the wheel. Everybody wants to try and do something and tackle it, but will only look at it from their own particular standpoint. And really what we're actually aiming to do from the safe haven perspective, and it's there for replication, is the fact that it's about an interfaith response, because it removes that sense of the cynicism of a secular society that actually considers faith communities as being part of the problem and not allowed to be part of the solution. And in a lot of ways, that in itself is a restorative practice. It allows for us to try and restore the sense of the sense of dignity to that human being that had actually experienced the wrong, and we can respond to it. So in a lot of ways, what I would sort of recommend is actually looking at what happens to those who don't report the crime. And in the Irish context, where there isn't one, does that mean that negates that person's opportunity to actually look for reparation, to look for compassion, to look for support, and to look for, you know, someone of faith, our neighbours in faith? It doesn't matter what the tradition is. It's that we're all neighbours in faith, and an attack on one faith tradition or an attack on somebody because their faith tradition is racialized or because of some other form of social identity, that we can rally around these individuals. And whether it's somebody who's experienced anti-Semitism and goes into a mosque because it's a safe space, or, you know, where I heard just I heard an example of where someone who's Muslim who had experienced it, and somebody of a Christian tradition steps forward rather than just being a bystander or a backstander, and actually offers in that moment a glint of compassion. There's where reparation occurs. And, you know, if somebody doesn't choose to report it, does that mean that they don't have the right to those supports? I think we need to be a little bit more wider in relation to how we look at victimhood and look at the experience and challenge from a societal perspective. And I think that's where faith has the advantage, because we've always been practicing that with our congregations. We do it internally to try and resolve conflict. And what I'm saying is, if we build solidarity, and if we build through interfaith perspective, it removes that cynicism where someone thinks, oh, you're just taking advantage of a vulnerable person and proselytizing instead. It removes that, because we're not looking at that. We're bringing faith back into the world and saying we still have an opportunity to be able to offer, you know, real world solutions in a very holistic and a spiritual way. It's, you know, and remove the taboo of being able to express faith.
Yeah, well, our group kind of focused on the historical, but I wanted to, and the academic, I wanted to sort of bring it back to the faith communities. I'm glad Darren mentioned what he did. I'm not a Christian. I'm not a member of the three big faiths. I'm actually a pagan. I'm also a Christian, but mostly pagan. And Oh, we're going through all sorts of things internally, including fighting off the right-wing pretenders. But a lot of us are very much involved in interfaith and want to try to make things more happier and more inclusive, more welcoming to pretty much anyone who's interested. But within two different strands of my faith group, what I wrote in the chat is happening, and it's happening now, and I'm arguing with people, and it takes a huge amount of energy because I'm doing it almost alone, almost entirely alone. And you know, there are people still using the N-word because they're older, and when I tell them that that's not appropriate, I can't believe they think it is. They're just saying, oh, well, I didn't know any better. And then, you know, and other folks using this excuse that wokery is wasting time and this is cancel culture. Some pagans are very individualistic and they want this freedom without responsibility thing. And I'm coming in and saying, well, okay, you want me to represent you and to meet with all these peoples of faith, but it goes beyond that for me. It's not just about faith. I'm involved in anti-racism, and and I give them a long list of things I'm involved in. So what's the difference? Oh, well, you want to tear down statues. You want to change the names of mascots. Blah blah blah. It gets really tiring. So my whole thought is amongst a lot of the interfaith folks, I'm still not so much as it used to be, kind of an outsider. And I really want to be part of this and find that shared community that has been mentioned, where we're working together in the safe spaces to sort this out in some way, in a way that will make a huge difference over time. And more immediately, if it's urgent, and usually is. Anyway, that was my long-winded way of saying that. How can I do this? And how can I continue to do this? But to do this with others.
You can hear the sense of frustration in me. I think one of the things that's really antagonized me over the last couple of years, now I don't know whether, I don't want to lay everything on the doorstep of Donald Trump, but this whole cancel culture thing seems to be an excuse for anything. And I was particularly grieved recently with it. This relates to this topic with comedian Jack D, who came away with an appalling statement on the travelling community in the Holocaust. And of course, I wrote something about how this was just unacceptable. And so many people then just having a go saying, oh, this is cancel culture. Are we not? What are the limits on jokes? Are you going to say, can you send us? People wrote to me and said to me, can you send us a list of jokes that are acceptable and unacceptable? For me, I've thought, surely it's not much of a skill of a comedian to say things that are funny without being racists, without making fun of, a whole Holocaust or a genocide against people. I don't understand it does frighten me a little bit of this cancel culture. I don't know what other people feel about this, because it does feel to me that even there were things a few years ago that you simply couldn't get away with saying. And if we go back to the time of Bernard Manning and terrible comedians in the 70s who made all these racist comments, they wouldn't be allowed today. But it does feel a little bit of, when you say something now, you're almost accused of being cancel culture. And I think one of the roles faith communities have is to actually speak with compassion and get people to think of, what is the effect of your words? How are your words able to hurt people? And to really think about the consequences of our words and our actions. But I could relate a lot to what Linda's saying. Yeah, to say.
We've got to be right up front. The fact is, somebody said the N-word, but I think that somebody coming on and said that something is superficial. Mm-hmm. It's the same. But that's okay. because it comes from an academic and it's in a national newspaper. And we've got to start speaking the truth. That when we see that, then we've got to recognize it for what it is. We don't say the N-word, but we say it's superficial, inferior, trivial. And the point is that what we've got to take away from today, we're one humanity. If you believe in what we're doing in terms of faith, then that's where we've got to start. And the rest is our making. It's cultural. And we've got to deal with that. It's cultural. We start with one humanity and the rest is cultural. We can change that.
Before we started, I was sharing something with the group, and I think with speakers, I think I'll share it again. I thought it was an interesting, useful thing to be thinking about. There was an article on 6 ways for religious and traditional leaders to fight racism. The first is listen and uplift the voices of people of colour and other marginalised groups in your community. So listen and uplift those voices. Encourage interreligious collaboration. We should be speaking out for others, speaking out against racism. And the example that we heard of when we come across someone of another community who's being abused because of they're wearing a hijab or how they look, that we should be challenging that. We should talk about privilege and oppression in our communities and thinking about what other people go through. Focus on educating children and youth and letting them lead the way forward. Encourage your community to speak out against racism. And we have to collaborate with government officials for institutional change. We have to put the pressure on our government to lead by example. Those are just a few brief things I'd like to end with. I just said there's been an incredible lot I'm going to take away from what people have said, and I think the onus is on us to collaborate more, but to actually challenge more when we come across racism.
Well, like you, Ian, I'd like to go back to our pre-event conversation, and we mentioned there the racial justice Sunday event that happens once a year, and I think I always felt an element of frustration when we talked about, although on the one hand is a good initiative from the church, but racial justice should not be one Sunday a year, should be every day, 24/7, because that's what it should be. I think this evening gave us an opportunity to realize the need for discussions like this, and the fact that we have a responsibility to take them into our own communities, into our own congregations, and create the spaces for these conversations to happen, because it's not easy. It's been pointed out, quite a few times. It's challenging, but we have to have this conversation. So we have to be creative and make those spaces